Imagine, if you will, a kingdom at the height of its power. The air in Jerusalem is thick with the scent of cedar wood, roasting lamb, and the metallic tang of bronze being forged into shields. This is the golden age of Israel, a time when the shepherd King David has solidified the borders and turned a collection of tribes into a regional superpower. But in the heart of the palace, amidst the tapestries of purple and the songs of the Levites, a storm is gathering. Not a storm of clouds and thunder, but a storm of blood and betrayal. And at the center of this storm stands a man whose very name meant Father of Peace, yet whose life would become a manual for war. His name was Absalom. To understand the tragedy of Absalom, we have to look past the Sunday school versions of the story and peer into the mirrors of the ancient world. You see, the Bible doesn't often pause to describe a man's physical appearance in detail. Usually, it focuses on the heart. But when it comes to Absalom, chroniclers of 2 Samuel stop dead in their tracks. They tell us that in all Israel, there was not a man so highly praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. He was the visual embodiment of the kingdom's prosperity, a walking, breathing masterpiece of genetic perfection. But beauty, when untethered from character, is a dangerous currency, and Absalom knew exactly how to spend it. Every year, when the heat of the Judean summer began to wane, a specific ritual took place in Jerusalem that would stop the city in its tracks. It was the cutting of the prince's hair. Now, this wasn't just a trip to a local barber. This was a state event. The scriptures tell us that he cut his hair once a year because it became too heavy for him. When he weighed it, the hair came to 200 shekels by the royal standard. Let that sink in for a moment. 200 shekels is roughly 5 pounds. Imagine carrying 5 pounds of dead weight on your head every single day. The sheer physical presence of that mane must have been staggering. It was thick, lustrous, and dark, a crown of natural glory that signaled to every observer that this man was favored by the heavens. But there is a detail in the Hebrew text that often gets overlooked, and it is the key to understanding Absalom's psychological warfare. The text specifies the weight was measured according to the king's weight. This is a massive strategic insight. You see, King David had recently standardized weights and measures. It was a move to centralize the economy, to ensure that a shekel in the north was the same as a shekel in the south. It was an exercise of royal authority. By insisting that his hair be weighed against the king's standard, Absalom wasn't just being vain. He was performing a calculated PR stunt. He was literally measuring his own physical glory against his father's legal decrees. He was saying to the people, "Look at me. My very body is validated by the king's own scales. My beauty is a matter of state record." He took a biological trait and transformed it into a state-validated miracle. He was the Prince of Perfection, and he wanted everyone to know that even the king's own laws had to bend to acknowledge his magnificence. But behind the flowing hair and the unblemished skin, a darkness was taking root. You have to wonder what it does to a man when he is told from birth that he is flawless. In a world of scarred warriors and weathered farmers, Absalom was a polished jewel. He lived in a world where appearances were everything, and he became a master of the mask. He understood that people follow what they admire, and they admire what looks like success. He was the first modern politician, centuries before the invention of the camera. He knew that if he could control the image, he could eventually control the kingdom. However, perfection is a fragile thing. It cannot tolerate a stain, and the first stain on Absalom's world didn't come from his own hand, but from within his own family. It was a stain of such horrific proportions that it shattered the illusion of the Father of Peace, and replaced it with a cold, calculating architect of revenge. The story takes a turn from the vanity of the scales to the shadows of the bedchamber. Absalom had a sister named Tamar. She was beautiful, much like her brother, and she was a virgin, a princess of the royal house. But she became the object of a twisted, obsessive lust from their half-brother Amnon, David's eldest son and the heir apparent to the throne. We won't dwell on the graphic details of Amnon's crime, but the Bible is clear. He lured her into a trap, he overpowered her, and he shamed her. And then, in a display of breathtaking cruelty, his love turned to an even greater hatred, and he had her thrown out like common trash. Tamar, humiliated and broken, went to her brother Absalom. She put ashes on her head and tore the many-colored robe that the virgin daughters of the king wore. She was a walking scream of agony. And this is where we see the first glimpse of the real Absalom. He didn't explode in a fit of rage. He didn't rush to the palace to demand an immediate execution. Instead, he looked at his weeping sister and said something that should chill us to the bone. "Has Amnon your brother been with you? Be quiet now, my sister. He is your brother. Don't take this thing to heart." On the surface, it sounds like he's trying to comfort her. But look closer. He told her to be quiet. He told her to bury the pain. He told her to wait. Why? Because Absalom was a hunter, and a hunter knows that if you strike too early, you miss. He was playing a long game. He took Tamar into his own house, where she lived as a desolate woman, a constant, living reminder of the injustice that had been allowed to fester in the house of David. And what of King David, the man after God's own heart, the giant killer? The scriptures say that when King David heard of these things, he was very wroth. He was furious. But here is the tragic sentence that follows. He did nothing. He didn't punish Amnon. He didn't exile him. He didn't even rebuke him. Historians and theologians have debated for millennia why David remained paralyzed. Perhaps it was because Amnon was his firstborn, the crown prince. Perhaps it was because David, remembering his own sin with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah, felt he had lost the moral high ground to dispense justice. But regardless of the reason, David's inaction created a power vacuum. In the absence of a king's justice, a prince's vengeance began to grow. David's failure to act was the catalyst for everything that followed. By choosing his son over the law, he lost both. He allowed a cancer to enter the royal family, and Absalom was the one who watched it spread. For 2 full years, not 2 weeks, not 2 months, but 2 entire years, Absalom did not speak a word to Amnon, either good or bad. Can you imagine the psychological pressure of that silence? Imagine sitting at the royal table, month after month, seeing the man who violated your sister, watching him eat the finest foods, watching him receive the honors of the heir apparent, and never saying a word. This wasn't the silence of forgiveness. This was the silence of a man who was building a gallows in his mind. Absalom's hatred was not a flash of lightning. It was a slow-burning fire that he tended with meticulous care. He let the anger ferment until it turned into something much more dangerous than rage. It turned into a plan. Absalom understood something about human nature that his father seemed to have forgotten. People will wait for justice for a long time, but they won't wait forever. And if the king won't provide it, they will look to whoever will. During those 2 years of silence, Absalom wasn't just brooding, he was observing. He saw how David's grip on the administration of justice was slipping. He saw the dissatisfied citizens coming to the palace and leaving without a resolution. He saw the cracks in the foundation of the Davidic dynasty, and he realized that the same perfection he used to win the people's hearts could be used to tear the kingdom down. The silence was a weapon. By not speaking to Amnon, Absalom made himself invisible. Amnon likely grew complacent. He probably thought, well, it's been a year. It's been 18 months. My brother has moved on. The king hasn't punished me, so I'm safe. That is the mistake every tyrant makes, confusing mercy with weakness and silence with consent. Absalom was waiting for the perfect moment, the alpha moment, where joy and vulnerability would intersect. He found it at the sheep-shearing festival in Baal Hazor. In the ancient world, sheep-shearing was more than just agricultural labor. It was a harvest festival. It was a time of immense celebration, heavy drinking, and communal joy. It was the one time of the year when the hard work of the shepherds was rewarded with a literal pile of wealth. It was also a time when guards were relaxed and hearts were merry. Absalom, the silent architect, went to his father, the king. With a voice that must have been as smooth as silk, he invited the king and all his servants to the feast. David, ever the cautious father, declined, not wanting to be a burden. But Absalom pressed him. He didn't want the king there. The king would be too observant, too much of a wild card. He wanted the king's sons. Specifically, he wanted Amnon. "If you will not go," Absalom said, "let my brother Amnon go with us." David hesitated. You can feel the tension in the text. "Why should he go with you?" the king asked. It's a haunting question. Did David suspect? Did he feel a shiver of divine warning? We don't know. But Absalom's persistence won out. David relented and sent Amnon and all the king's sons to the feast. The scene at Baal Hazor must have been spectacular. The rolling hills of Ephraim, the white wool piled high like snow, the smell of wine and roasted meat. Absalom, the perfect host, greeted his brothers with smiles and open arms. He played the part of the loving brother to perfection. He ensured the wine flowed freely. He waited until Amnon's heart was merry with wine, until the heir to the throne was sluggish, happy, and completely off his guard. This is the cold-blooded patience that David lacked. David was a man of passion. He killed Goliath in a burst of faith. He took Bathsheba in a burst of lust. But Absalom was a man of the cold. He had instructed his servants with chilling precision. Mark well when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, smite Amnon, then kill him. Fear not. Have not I commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant. Notice the language he uses. He frames a cold-blooded assassination as an act of courage and valor. He takes the language of the battlefield and applies it to a murder at a dinner table. And when the command was given, the servants obeyed. In an instant, the festival of joy turned into a slaughterhouse. Amnon, the firstborn, the rapist, the protected son, was dead on the floor of his brother's tent. The panic that followed was total. The other king's sons didn't wait to see if they were next. They jumped on their mules and fled for their lives. A rumor even reached David in Jerusalem that Absalom had killed all the king's sons, that not one was left. The king tore his clothes and lay on the ground in agony, believing his entire legacy had been wiped out in a single afternoon of blood. But Jonadab, the same man who had originally given Amnon the wicked advice to trap Tamar, stood by the king and said, "Do not let my lord suppose they have killed all the young men, the king's sons, for Amnon alone is dead. For by the mouth of Absalom this has been determined from the day that he forced his sister Tamar." Think about that. Everyone knew. The court knew. The advisors knew. The plan had been written on Absalom's face for 2 years, yet David had remained blind. Absalom didn't just kill a man. He executed a sentence that the king was too weak to carry out. In doing so, he didn't just seek revenge. He announced himself as the true arbiter of justice in Israel. He had stepped into the vacuum David left behind. Absalom fled to Geshur, to the house of his maternal grandfather, and stayed there for 3 years. 3 more years of waiting. 3 more years of David mourning for the son he lost and longing for the son who killed him. The Prince of Perfection was now in exile, but even in exile, he was the center of gravity for the kingdom. This is the tragedy of the house of David. A father who loved his sons more than he loved justice, and a son who loved justice more than he loved his father. But a justice that was warped by his own vanity and ambition. Absalom's hair continued to grow in Geshur. His beauty remained unblemished. But the silent architect was no longer just building a gallows for his brother. He was now building a throne for himself. We see here a masterclass in the slow-burn revolution. Most coups happen in a night. Absalom's coup took 5 years of preparation, 2 years of silence in Jerusalem, and 3 years of exile in Geshur. He was the man who could wait. He was the man who understood that if you want to replace a legend like David, you cannot do it with a sudden strike. You have to let the legend fade. You have to let the people's frustration with the current administration grow. You have to become the alternative that everyone is whispering about. When we look at these first 2 chapters of Absalom's life, we see a man who is the ultimate alpha ingredient. He is the standard against which the kingdom is measured. He is the one who handles the king's weight. He is the one who handles the king's justice. And as he sits in Geshur, looking back toward Jerusalem, knows that the path to the throne is paved with the hair he cuts, the blood he sheds, and the silence he maintains. The Prince of Perfection was coming back, and when he returned, he wouldn't be coming as a son seeking a father's embrace. He would be coming as a king seeking a father's crown. The scales were already tipped. The weight of the hair was just the beginning. The weight of the kingdom was next. Consider the psychological toll on Tamar during those 3 years. While Absalom was in Geshur, she remained in his house in Jerusalem, a living monument to a crime that had been settled with more crime. The Bible tells us she remained desolate. In the ancient world, to be desolate meant to be without a future, without a husband, without a legacy. She was the ghost in the palace, the silent witness to the fact that in the house of David, things were broken beyond repair. And David? David was caught in the worst kind of grief, the grief of the guilty. He missed Absalom. The text says his soul longed to go forth unto Absalom. He wanted to bring him home, but he didn't know how to do it without acknowledging the bloody mess he had allowed to happen. He was a king who had lost his moral compass, wandering in the fog of his own past failures. This is the stage upon which the next act of the drama unfolds. A broken king, a desolate princess, a dead heir, and a prince in exile who has already proven he has the patience of a statue and the heart of a wolf. Absalom had learned that his father would not act unless forced. He had learned that the people would follow a man who took decisive action. And he had learned that beauty and blood were a potent mix for the imagination of the masses. As we move forward into the heart of the rebellion, remember the king's weight. Remember that 5-pound crown of hair. It was a sign of God's blessing that Absalom turned into a sign of his own divinity. It was the alpha information that defined his public persona. He was the man who was literally worth more, according to the scales. And in a world where might often made right, Absalom was preparing to prove that he was the heaviest force in Israel. The story of Absalom is a warning that the things we admire most, beauty, talent, patience, and the desire for justice, can become the very instruments of our destruction if they are not rooted in something deeper than ourselves. Absalom was a man who had everything, yet he felt he had nothing as long as he was second to a father he no longer respected. In Geshur, among the pagans, away from the tabernacle and the songs of Zion, the Prince of Perfection was refining his image. He was shedding the skin of the grieving brother and putting on the armor of the usurper. He was no longer just the father of peace. He was becoming the father of the sword. And the silence of Jerusalem was about to be broken by the sound of 1,000 chariots and the shout of a people who had forgotten that a king's beauty is found in his righteousness, not in the weight of his hair. Wait for the moment when the exile returns. Wait for the moment when the prince stands at the gate. Because when Absalom returns to Jerusalem, he won't be looking for a haircut. He'll be looking for a head to wear the crown. And he's already shown that he knows exactly how to use the king's standard to measure exactly what he thinks he is owed. The tragedy is that David, in his longing, was about to give Absalom exactly what he wanted, a way back into the heart of the kingdom without a heart of repentance. It was the final mistake of a father who couldn't say no to a son who looked like a god. As the dust settles on the hills of Ephraim and the blood of Amnon soaks into the earth, the true rebellion is just beginning to breathe. It's a rebellion born in the silence of 2 years and the exile of 3. It's a rebellion that knows how to use the law to break the law. And it all started with a man who was so perfect he couldn't see the blemish in his own soul. Imagine the conversations in the marketplaces of Israel during those 5 years, the whispers of the merchants, the gossip of the women at the well. Have you heard of the prince, the one with the hair that weighs 5 pounds? He killed the rapist when the king would not. He is a man of action. He is a man of justice. Why is he in exile while the king sits in his palace and does nothing? This is how a hero is made in the eyes of a frustrated public. You take a man of extraordinary physical beauty. You give him a cause that feels righteous, revenge for a violated sister, and you let him become a martyr in exile. Absalom was winning the hearts of Israel before he ever set foot back in the city. He was the alpha candidate, the one the people were waiting for. David was the old lion, scarred and weary. Absalom was the young stag, radiant and relentless. The contrast was too sharp to ignore. And as the news of Absalom's life in Geshur trickled back to Jerusalem, the anticipation grew. The people didn't want a king who mourned in the dust. They wanted a king who shone like the sun. They wanted the Prince of Perfection. But as we will see, the sun that shines too brightly often burns everything it touches. The Father of Peace was preparing a war that would leave no one unscarred. The hair that was his glory would one day be his noose. The scales that measured his worth would one day measure his downfall. But for now, in the quiet of the exile, the architect is at work. The blueprint is set. The ingredients are gathered, and the masterpiece of betrayal is almost ready for its grand unveiling. The Prince of Silence is about to speak, and when he does, the very foundations of Israel will tremble. Think about the patience required to stay in Geshur for 3 years. For a man of Absalom's ambition, every day must have felt like a century. He was in the prime of his life, his beauty at its peak, and he was tucked away in a small Aramean kingdom. But he didn't rush. He didn't send frantic letters begging for mercy. He stayed in the shadows, letting David's guilt do the work for him. He knew his father. He knew that David's heart would eventually break, and when it did, the gates of Jerusalem would swing wide. This is the alpha level of manipulation. It's not about pushing, it's about pulling. Absalom pulled on his father's heartstrings from hundreds of miles away. He made his absence more powerful than his presence could ever be. He became a ghost that haunted David's dreams, a reminder of the son he had failed and the son he had lost. And meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, the administrative machinery of the kingdom was grinding to a halt. David was distracted, consumed by his internal struggles. The people's grievances were piling up. The justice system was failing. The king's weight was being used for trade, but the king's justice was nowhere to be found. The stage was being perfectly set for a savior. And Absalom, with his 5 pounds of hair and his unblemished skin, was more than happy to play the part. He was the alpha ingredient in a recipe for disaster. When you look at the total span of these 5 years, you see a transformation. Absalom went into the silence as a grieving brother. He came out of the exile as a political predator. The Prince of Perfection had found his purpose, and it wasn't to serve the kingdom, it was to own it. The story of Absalom isn't just a history lesson. It's a deep dive into the mechanics of the human heart when it is consumed by the need for validation and the thirst for power. It shows us that beauty can be a shield for the most hideous intentions, and that silence can be the loudest warning of a coming storm. As we close these first 2 chapters, the tension is at a breaking point. The prince is in Geshur, the king is in Jerusalem, and the shadow of Tamar hangs over them both. The king's weight has been established, but the true cost of Absalom's ambition is yet to be tallied. The next time we see Absalom, he will be standing at the gates of the city, not as a returning son, but as a wolf in sheep's clothing, or rather, a wolf in the most beautiful hair in the world. The alpha play is about to begin. The Prince of Silence is about to find his voice, and the kingdom of Israel will never be the same. Consider for a moment the sheer audacity of Absalom's hair being weighed by the king's standard. In any other context, this would be seen as a minor detail, a quirk of a vain prince. But in the context of a brewing rebellion, it is a revolutionary act. It is a claim to the throne hidden in a grooming routine. It is Absalom saying, "I am the standard. I am the one who truly fits the king's measures." This is the kind of detail that makes the Bible so much more than a collection of moral tales. It is a gritty, realistic look at power dynamics. It shows us that the alpha ingredients of history are often found in the small, seemingly insignificant choices of the powerful. The way a man wears his hair, the way a king reacts to a crime, the length of time a brother stays silent. These are the threads that weave the tapestry of a nation's fate. Absalom was a master weaver. He took the threads of David's failures and his own perfections and began to create a new reality for Israel. A reality where the Father of Peace would bring a sword, and the Prince of Perfection would lead a nation into the heart of darkness. So as we prepare to see the return of the Prince, ask yourself, what are the king's weights in our own lives? What are the perfections we polish while our hearts are building gallows? The story of Absalom is a mirror, and if we look closely enough, we might see more than just a handsome prince staring back. We might see the beginning of our own silent rebellions. The journey from the beauty of the scales to the blood of the sheep shearing is a short one when the heart is set on its own glory. Absalom has made that journey. He has crossed the line from victim to villain, from brother to butcher. And now he is ready to take the final step. The Prince of Silence is coming home, and he's bringing the storm with him. Wait for the return. Wait for the gates to open, because the alpha ingredients are about to be mixed into a cocktail of betrayal that will burn the house of David to the ground. The story of Absalom is just getting started, and the king's weight is about to be felt by every man, woman, and child in Israel. Imagine the atmosphere in the royal court as the news arrives that Joab, David's general, is beginning to plot a way to bring Absalom back. The tension is palpable. Everyone knows that the king wants his son home, but everyone also knows the danger that son represents. The Prince of Perfection is a polarizing figure, even in his absence. Joab, ever the pragmatist, sees that the king's grief is affecting his ability to lead. He decides to force David's hand, using a wise woman from Tekoa to weave a parable that mirrors David's own situation. It is a masterful piece of theater, a success recipe of its own, designed to catch the king in his own logic. But even as Joab works to bring the prince home, you have to wonder if he knows what he's truly unleashing. Does he see the alpha ambition in Absalom's eyes? Or is he, like everyone else, blinded by the luster of the prince's reputation? Absalom's return will not be a moment of reconciliation. It will be a moment of escalation. The 3 years in Geshur haven't softened him. They have sharpened him. He is like a blade that has been honed in secret, waiting for the right moment to strike. And David? David is about to welcome the blade into his own home. He is about to give the Prince of Silence the platform he needs to start the loudest revolution in Israel's history. This is the tragedy of the Father of Peace. He creates a war because he cannot find the strength to enforce a true peace. He allows the Prince of Perfection to return without repentance, setting the stage for a conflict that will tear his family and his kingdom apart. The hair is growing. The weights are ready. The silence is about to end. The Alpha Prince is coming back to Jerusalem, and he's not coming to serve. He's coming to rule. As we transition into the next phase of this strategic breakdown, keep these images in mind. The 5-pound crown of hair, the desolate princess in the shadowed room, the blood on the floor of the festival tent, and the silent prince watching it all from a distance. These are the ingredients of the rebellion of Absalom. This is how perfection becomes a plague. The story of Absalom is a masterpiece of narrative tension, and we are only just scratching the surface. The real alpha moves are yet to come. The gate of the city is waiting. The hearts of the people are waiting. And the Prince of Perfection is ready to give them exactly what they think they want. But as we will see, the king's weight is a heavy thing to carry, and not even the most perfect man in Israel can hold it for long without it crushing him. The rebellion is breathing. The storm is coming, and the Prince of Silence is about to let out a roar that will be heard for generations. The transformation of Absalom from a favored son to a cold-blooded revolutionary is one of the most chilling character arcs in all of literature. It serves as a stark reminder that talent and charisma, when divorced from integrity, are nothing more than tools for destruction. Absalom's beauty was his brand, his silence was his strategy, and his revenge was his resume. He was the complete package, a man built for the throne, yet entirely unfit for it. As we look at the ruins of his family and the impending ruin of his kingdom, we see the true cost of David's parental inaction. By failing to lead his home, David lost his right to lead his nation without challenge. The king's weight wasn't just about silver and gold. It was about the moral weight of leadership. And in that, David had been found wanting. Absalom, however, was more than happy to step onto the scales. He was a man who believed his own press, a man who thought his 5 pounds of hair made him a giant. He was about to find out that being a king requires more than just looking the part. It requires a heart that is after God's, not one that is after its own glory. But for now, the prince is the hero of the hour. The exile is over. The Prince of Perfection is back in the city of his father. And the alpha ingredients of his plan are finally falling into place. The gates of Jerusalem are open, and the Prince of Silence is ready to make his move. The narrative hook has been set. Beauty has become the instrument of doom. The prophetic storm is moving slow, inevitable, and terrible. And at the center of it all stands Absalom, the man who would be king, the man who turned perfection into a plague. Wait for the next chapter. Wait for the chariots. Wait for the moment when the Father of Peace finally meets the Prince of War. The story of Absalom is a journey into the heart of betrayal, and we are just getting started. The king's weight is about to be tested, and the results will change the world forever. Stay tuned as we continue this strategic breakdown of the rebellion of Absalom. The alpha ingredients are only going to get more powerful from here. The Prince of Perfection is about to show his true colors, and they are the colors of blood and gold. Jerusalem is waiting. The throne is waiting. And the most handsome man in Israel is ready to take what he believes is his. The silence is over. The rebellion has begun. The architect of the long game, Ahithophel's shadow. To understand the sheer magnitude of the rebellion that was about to unfold, we have to look away from the Golden Prince for a moment and peer into the darkest corners of the king's own inner circle. Every great uprising requires more than just a charismatic face. It requires a brain, a cold, calculating intelligence that understands the mechanics of power and the vulnerabilities of the human heart. For Absalom, that brain belonged to a man named Ahithophel. In the ancient world, Ahithophel was a legend. The scriptures describe his counsel as if a man had inquired at the oracle of God. When Ahithophel spoke, People didn't just listen, they obeyed. He was David's most brilliant strategist, the man who had helped build the kingdom from the ground up. But while the world saw a loyal advisor, a much more sinister transformation was taking place beneath the surface. To the public, he was the king's right hand. To himself, he was a man waiting for a debt to be paid in blood. The alpha secret to Ahithophel's betrayal is hidden in the genealogies, those long lists of names we often skip over. If you cross-reference 2 Samuel 11:3 and 23:34, a shocking picture emerges. We learn that Bathsheba was the daughter of Eliam, and Eliam was the son of Ahithophel. This means that Ahithophel was Bathsheba's grandfather. Suddenly, the entire narrative shifts. The betrayal of David by his top advisor wasn't a sudden whim or a calculated political gamble. It was a decade-long, long game for revenge. Imagine the scene in Ahithophel's house years earlier when the news arrived about what David had done to Bathsheba. Imagine the grandfather's fury as he learned that the king, the man he served, the man who sang songs of righteousness, had used his power to take Ahithophel's granddaughter, and then, to cover his tracks, had orchestrated the state-sanctioned murder of her husband, Uriah the Hittite. For years, Ahithophel sat at David's table, offering brilliant advice, maintaining the facade of loyalty, while his heart was a furnace of cold, hard rage. He watched David's public displays of repentance. He heard the psalms of contrition, and he likely felt nothing but disgust. To Ahithophel, David wasn't a man after God's own heart. He was a predator who had destroyed a family. The prince of silence, Absalom, had found his perfect match in the advisor of shadows. Both men were masters of the mask. Both men were fueled by a sense of injustice. And both men were willing to wait years for the perfect moment to strike. This alliance was the true turning point. Absalom provided the image, the hair, the beauty, the royal blood. But Ahithophel provided the legitimacy and the strategic depth. When word reached David that Ahithophel had joined the conspiracy, it was the only time we see the king truly terrified. David didn't fear Absalom's chariots as much as he feared Ahithophel's mind. He knew that with Ahithophel directing the storm, the rebellion wasn't just a family feud. It was a surgical strike against the very foundations of his reign. The depth of Ahithophel's hatred becomes chillingly clear later in the story, but the seeds were sown here. He wasn't just looking to replace David. He was looking to humiliate him. He wanted to see David suffer the same public shame that his granddaughter had endured in private. This was a poetic eye for an eye vendetta that had been simmering for over 10 years. While David was busy dealing with the fallout of his own sins, he never realized that his most trusted counselor was the one handing the matches to his son. Consider the psychological landscape of Jerusalem during this time. You have a king who is aging and perhaps softened by his own guilt. You have a prince who is the most handsome man in the world, living in a house of silence and secrets. And you have the kingdom's greatest mind, sitting in the shadows, weaving a web of betrayal that spans generations. It was a perfect storm of vanity, vengeance, and vice. Ahithophel's involvement gave the rebellion an intellectual weight it otherwise would have lacked. He knew where the bodies were buried. He knew the weaknesses of David's generals. He knew the logistical bottlenecks of the Judean military. Most importantly, he knew the king's psyche. He knew that David's greatest strength, his heart, was also his greatest weakness. He knew exactly how to twist the knife to make David flee rather than fight. The alpha enrichment here is the realization that the rebellion of Absalom was, in many ways, the delayed payment for the sin with Bathsheba. The prophet Nathan had told David that the sword would never depart from his house. But David likely didn't expect the sword to be held by his own son and guided by his own grandfather-in-law. It is a terrifying reminder that our private actions have public consequences that can echo through decades, resurfacing in the most unexpected and devastating ways. Ahithophel was the bridge between the personal and the political. He turned a son's ambition into a grandfather's vendetta. He took Absalom's raw material and shaped it into a revolution. And as they met in secret, planning the downfall of the giant killer, the air in Jerusalem must have grown heavy with the scent of an impending collapse. The Prince of Perfection had found his architect, and the Father of Peace was about to find out that peace is a fragile thing when it is built on a foundation of hidden blood. The shadow government, war at the gates. While Ahithophel was orchestrating the high-level strategy, Absalom was busy winning the ground war, and he didn't do it with a sudden military coup. He did it through a process of shadow governance that lasted 4 years. This is where we see Absalom's true genius for manipulation. He understood that to take the throne, he didn't need to defeat David's army first. He needed to delegitimize David's authority in the minds of the common people. Every morning, before the sun had fully crested the hills of Moab, Absalom would rise and head to the city gate. Now, to a modern reader, standing at a gate sounds like a casual activity. But in the ancient Near East, the gate was the center of the universe. It was the marketplace, the town square, and most importantly, it was the Supreme Court. It was where the elders sat, where contracts were signed, and where justice was dispensed. If you had a grievance, you went to the gate. But David's administration was struggling. The kingdom had grown too fast, and the bureaucratic machinery was grinding to a halt. There were judicial delays. People were traveling from the far corners of Israel, from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south, only to find that the king was busy or that there was no one appointed to hear their case. They were frustrated, tired, and felt forgotten by the man they had once hailed as their savior. Enter Absalom. But he didn't arrive alone. He arrived with a display of power that Jerusalem had never seen. He prepared for himself chariots and horses, and 50 men to run before him. Imagine the visual impact. In an era where most people walked or rode donkeys, here was the Prince of Perfection, shimmering in the morning light, preceded by a phalanx of 50 elite runners. It was a spectacle of royal majesty that made David's aging court look dusty and outdated. Absalom would stand near the way of the gate, and whenever a man had a controversy and came to the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him. He didn't wait for the people to come to him. He went to them. "From what city are you?" he would ask with a voice full of feigned concern. The man would answer, "Your servant is of such and such a tribe of Israel." And then Absalom would deliver the masterpiece of political manipulation. He would look the man in the eye, perhaps placing a hand on his shoulder, and say, "See, your claims are good and right, but there is no man deputed of the king to hear you." Think about the brilliance of that statement. In one sentence, he validated the person's grievance, "Your claims are right," and simultaneously gutted the king's reputation. The king has no one to hear you. He didn't attack David directly. That would have been seen as treasonous. Instead, he attacked David's administration. He weaponized bureaucratic frustration. He made the people feel that their king had abandoned them, not out of malice, but out of incompetence or neglect. And then he would drop the alpha hook. "Oh, that I were made judge in the land, that every man which hath any suit or cause might come unto me, and I would do him justice." This is the classic populist tactic. He wasn't asking for the crown. He was volunteering for the work of justice. He was presenting himself as the people's prince, the one who was willing to do the hard work that the king was too distracted to perform. He was building a shadow government at the very gate where the actual government was failing. But it wasn't just his words, it was his touch. The scriptures say that whenever a man came near to bow down to him, Absalom would reach out his hand, take hold of him, and kiss him. In the ancient world, this was an extraordinary gesture of humility from a prince of the blood. He was breaking the barriers between the monarchy and the masses. And on this manner did Absalom to all Israel that came to the king for judgment, the text tells us. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. The word stole is deliberate. This wasn't a legitimate winning of hearts through service. It was a theft through seduction. For 4 long years, Absalom practiced this shadow governance. Every day he was there. Every day he was listening. Every day he was sowing seeds of doubt about David's fitness to lead. He was creating a narrative that David was the king of the past, and Absalom was the king of the future. He weaponized the king's weight once again. This time, it wasn't the weight of his hair, but the weight of the law. He made himself the ultimate advocate for the common man. He understood that people don't rebel because of complex theological arguments. They rebel because their taxes are too high, their court cases are stuck in probate, and they feel like the people in power don't care about their daily struggles. Absalom became the face of caring. During those 4 years, David remained curiously blind. Perhaps he thought Absalom was just being a good prince, helping out with the administrative load. Perhaps he was relieved that his son was finally taking an interest in the affairs of the state. But David failed to see that Absalom wasn't helping the administration. He was replacing it. He was building a parallel power structure right under David's nose. The 50 runners were more than just a parade. They were a mobile communications network. They were the ones spreading the word throughout the tribes. The prince is at the gate. The prince will hear you. The prince thinks you are right. By the time the actual coup began, the hearts of the people had already moved. They didn't need to be convinced to follow Absalom. They were already his. This is the strategic insight that every leader must understand. Loyalty is not a static thing. It must be tended. If you leave a vacuum in the administration of justice, someone else will fill it. If you allow the gates of your organization or your family to become places of frustration rather than places of resolution, an Absalom will eventually show up with 50 runners and a seductive smile. Absalom's shadow governance was the ultimate long game preparation. He knew that when the time came to blow the trumpet in Hebron, he wouldn't need a massive army to take Jerusalem. He already owned the hearts of the people inside the walls. He had spent 4 years dismantling David's legitimacy, one handshake, one kiss, and one "your claims are right" at a time. The Prince of Perfection had become the king of the gate, and the father of peace was about to find out that while he was mourning for the son he had lost, he had been systematically robbed of the kingdom he had built. The alpha ingredients were all in place: the brain of Ahithophel, the beauty of Absalom, and the frustration of the people. The fuse was lit, and it had been burning for 4 long, silent years. Imagine the scene at the end of those 4 years. Absalom feels the time is right. The fruit is ripe for the picking. He goes to his father, the king, with one last lie. He asks for permission to go to Hebron to fulfill a vow he made while he was in Geshur. He plays the card of the pious son one final time. "I pray thee, let me go and pay my vow, which I have vowed unto the Lord in Hebron," he says. "For thy servant vowed a vow while I abode at Geshur in Syria, saying, If the Lord shall bring me again indeed to Jerusalem, then I will serve the Lord." And David, the man who wanted so badly to believe in his son's restoration, says the words that would haunt him forever: "Go in peace." David sent him to Hebron, the very place where David himself had been crowned king. It was a symbolic choice of devastating proportions. Absalom wasn't going to fulfill a vow. He was going to fulfill a destiny he had manufactured in the shadows of the gate and the silence of the exile. He took 200 men with him from Jerusalem, men who went in their simplicity, not knowing the plan. He wanted them there as human shields and as witnesses. He wanted the elite of Jerusalem to be seen with him when the trumpet blew. And then he sent for Ahithophel. The conspiracy was now complete. The beauty of the prince, the brains of the advisor, and the location of the first coronation. The shadow governance was about to become the only governance. The king's weight was about to be dropped on the head of the man who had authorized it. As we look at these 4 years of preparation, we see a masterclass in patient subversion. Absalom didn't need to be a great warrior. He just needed to be a great listener. He didn't need to be a better man than David. He just needed to look like a more attentive one. He turned the gate into his throne room, and the people's grievances into his scepter. The lesson of the gate is a warning to every leader. The place where you fail to provide justice is the place where your successor will be born. Absalom didn't create the frustration in Israel, he just harvested it. He found the cracks in David's house and filled them with his own ambition. The Prince of Silence had been speaking at the gate for 4 years, and his message had been simple: "I am here, I am listening, and I am yours." By the time David realized what was happening, the Father of Peace was a king without a kingdom, and the Prince of Perfection was a rebel with a nation at his back. The story of the gate is the story of how power is actually won, not in the heat of a single battle, but in the thousands of small interactions that define a leader's reputation. Absalom understood the alpha power of the small gesture. He knew that a kiss at the gate was worth more than 1,000 decrees from the palace, and he used that knowledge to tear down the greatest king Israel had ever known. Wait for the trumpet in Hebron. Wait for the moment when the shadow government steps into the light. Because when the sound of the horn echoes through the hills of Judah, the time for talking will be over. The Prince of Perfection is about to claim his prize, and the Father of Peace is about to become a fugitive in his own land. The gates are closed. The hearts are stolen. The architect has spoken. The rebellion of Absalom is no longer a shadow. It is a reality. And it all started with a man who was willing to stand at the gate and tell people exactly what they wanted to hear. As we move toward the final chapter of this tragedy, remember the alpha enrichment of Ahithophel's vendetta. Remember the 4 years of patient waiting at the gate. This wasn't a tragedy of errors. It was a tragedy of design. Every move was calculated. Every smile was a strategy. Every embrace was a betrayal. Absalom had mastered the success recipe of revolution. He had the structure, the ingredients, and the persona. He was the perfect rebel, and he was about to create a perfect disaster. But as the trumpet sounds in Hebron, we have to ask, can a kingdom built on a stolen heart ever truly stand? Can the king's weight be held by hands that are stained with the blood of a brother and the betrayal of a father? The answer is coming, and it will be found in a forest of tangled trees and a crown of tangled hair. The Prince of Silence is about to find out that the gates of justice work both ways, and the king's standard eventually measures everyone, even the man who thought he was beyond measure. Consider the sheer scale of the deception. 200 men from Jerusalem, the cream of the crop, led into a trap of their own loyalty. Ahithophel, the wisest man in the world, putting his brilliance at the service of a grudge. And Absalom, the golden boy, standing in the center of it all, believing his own lies. The rebellion was a masterpiece of alpha information and shadow governance. It was the ultimate success recipe for a coup. But as the dust rises from the road to Hebron, we see the true nature of what has been built. It is a house of cards, held together by vanity and vengeance. And in the palace in Jerusalem, a king is about to wake up to a nightmare. The Father of Peace is about to lose everything. But in the losing, he might just find the one thing Absalom never had: a heart that is truly after God's, even when it is broken. The stage is set for the final confrontation. The Prince of Perfection versus the man after God's own heart. The king's weight is about to be measured one last time. As we conclude this exploration of the shadow governance and the grandfather's vendetta, think about the silence that preceded the storm. For 4 years, Jerusalem was a city of whispers. For 4 years, the tension grew, and now the silence is broken. The rebellion of Absalom is no longer a secret. It is a war, and the Prince of Perfection is leading the charge. But wait, there is one more detail, one more alpha ingredient that will change everything. Because while Absalom was winning the hearts of the people, he was losing the favor of the King of Kings. And in the end, that is the only weight that truly matters. The story of the gate is a story of human strategy, but the story of the forest will be a story of divine justice. Are you ready for the end? Are you ready to see what happens when the Prince of Silence finally meets his match? The trumpet is sounding. Hebron is shouting. Jerusalem is fleeing. The rebellion is here, and the hair that was once the prince's glory is about to become his grave. Stay tuned for the final chapter, The Tangled Crown. We will see how the alpha ingredients of Absalom's life, his beauty, his ambition, and his hair, finally collide in a moment of terrible symmetry. The king's weight is calling, and the Prince of Perfection is about to pay the price. Imagine the confusion of those 200 men who followed Absalom to Hebron. They thought they were going for a religious festival. They thought they were honoring God. They were men of integrity, simple men in the best sense of the word. And suddenly they find themselves in the middle of a treasonous plot. This is how evil often works. It hitches a ride on the integrity of others. It uses the simple to mask the sinister. Absalom didn't just steal the hearts of the people. He stole the presence of the righteous. He wanted the look of a holy movement without the heart of one. He was a master of optics. To any outside observer, it looked like the best of Israel was moving toward Hebron. It looked like a divine mandate. But Ahithophel knew better. And David, when he heard the news, knew better. He knew that this wasn't a movement of God. It was a movement of the flesh. It was the harvest of his own failures, grown in the fertile soil of his son's vanity. This is the deeper layer of the shadow governance. It wasn't just about court cases. It was about the manipulation of spiritual perception. Absalom used a vow to the Lord as a cover for a coup against the Lord's anointed. It was the ultimate cynical play. And as he stood in Hebron, surrounded by the men he had deceived and the advisor who hated his father, Absalom must have felt invincible. He had followed the blueprint. He had gathered the ingredients. He had perfected the persona. He was, in his own eyes, the perfect king. But perfection is a dangerous word in the Bible. It is often a trap. The only one who is truly perfect is God, and any man who tries to claim that mantle for himself is headed for a fall. The Prince of Perfection was about to experience the weight of that truth. The king's standard was coming, and it wouldn't be measuring hair. It would be measuring the soul. The road from Hebron to Jerusalem is a short one, but for David, it was the longest journey of his life. As he fled his own city, weeping and barefoot, he was at his lowest point. But in that low point, he was more a king than Absalom would ever be, because David, in his brokenness, was still looking to God. Absalom, in his perfection, was only looking at himself. The shadow government was about to take the city, but it would never take the kingdom. Because a kingdom is more than a palace and a gate. It is a covenant, and Absalom had no place in that covenant. He had the hair, he had the chariots, he had the wise man, but he didn't have the king. As we move toward the final chapter, keep the image of the gate in your mind. It was the place where Absalom won the people, and it will be the place where the news of his death will eventually break his father's heart. The gate of justice is a place of terrible symmetry. The Prince of Silence is about to meet the God of justice, and the outcome has already been weighed. The king's weight is absolute, and Absalom is about to be found wanting. The rebellion is in full swing. The armies are gathering. The forest of Ephraim is waiting, and the Prince of Perfection is riding his mule toward his final destiny. The tangled crown, the forest of devouring, and the eternal rubble. The stage was set for the final act of this Shakespearean tragedy. But the theater was not a palace or a city gate. It was a labyrinth of limestone and leaves. The rebellion of Absalom, which had begun in the silence of a brother's house and matured in the shadows of the city gates, was about to meet its violent end in the forest of Ephraim. This wasn't a forest as we might imagine today, serene and park-like. This was a topographical nightmare, a jagged landscape of deep ravines, slippery limestone cliffs, and a dense, suffocating canopy of terebinth and oak trees. It was a place where light struggled to reach the floor, and where an army could lose its soul before it ever saw the enemy. Absalom had the numbers, he had the momentum, he had the stolen hearts of the masses. But David had something else. He had the mighty men. These weren't just soldiers, They were the legendary Giborim, guerrilla warfare experts who had spent decades fighting in the caves of Adullam and the deserts of Ziph. They knew how to make the terrain work for them. While Absalom's army was massive, it was largely composed of inexperienced volunteers, men who had been seduced by a smile and a kiss at the gate, but had never stood their ground against a charging Philistine. The strategic brilliance of David's generals, led by the ruthless Joab, was to funnel this bloated, disorganized mass of men into the narrow ravines of the forest. They didn't meet them on an open plain where numbers would matter. Instead, they baited them into the woods. In those tight limestone corridors, the advantage of a large army evaporates. Men trip over roots. They lose sight of their commanders. They panic as arrows rain down from the heights. The Bible records a chilling statistic. The forest devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. Think about that phrase, the forest of devouring. It suggests a landscape that had become an active participant in the judgment of a king. Men weren't just being killed by steel. They were falling into pits, being crushed in stampedes, and getting lost in the green maze, only to be picked off by the veterans who moved through the trees like ghosts. The 20,000 men who fell that day weren't just casualties of war. They were victims of a prince who understood PR, but didn't understand the price of blood. And then we come to the moment that has been etched into the memory of history, the moment of terrible irony. Absalom, the prince of perfection, was riding through the forest on a mule. Now, in the ancient world, the mule was not a humble beast of burden. It was the royal mount. King David himself rode a mule. By choosing this animal, Absalom was once again signaling his claim to the throne. He was riding as a king through a canopy he didn't respect. As the battle turned into a rout and the screams of his men filled the air, Absalom found himself riding hard under the thick boughs of a great oak. And here, the alpha ingredient of his life, the very thing that defined his public image, became his executioner. His hair, that legendary mane that weighed 5 pounds by the king's weight, got tangled in the low-hanging branches of the tree. The mule, sensing the panic and the sudden weight change, kept running, leaving the prince suspended between heaven and earth. The irony is breathtaking. The hair that was his glory became his noose. The perfection he had cultivated and measured against the royal standard was the very thing that trapped him. He was caught in the king's standard, held fast by the natural world he had tried to dominate with his vanity. He was a king without a throne, a rider without a mount, hanging in the air like a piece of fruit ripening for the harvest of justice. A soldier saw him and brought word to Joab. Joab, the man who had once helped bring Absalom back from exile, had no room for sentimentality. He knew that as long as Absalom lived, the kingdom would be divided. Despite David's explicit command to deal gently with the young man Absalom, Joab took 3 javelins in his hand. Let's pause on that number, 3. Some scholars suggest a symbolic link here. One for the murder of Amnon, one for the betrayal of David, and one for the stealing of the hearts of Israel. Joab plunged those javelins into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive, hanging in the oak. Then Joab's 10 armor-bearers surrounded the prince and finished the job. The man who had sought to be the highest in the land ended his life pinned to a tree, pierced by the very men he had once sought to lead. The Prince of Perfection was dead. But the story doesn't end with the fall of the prince. It ends with the eternal heap of stones. After the battle, the victors took Absalom's body and threw it into a great pit in the forest. They didn't give him a royal burial. They didn't carry him back to Jerusalem to lie in state. Instead, they heaped a very great pile of stones over him. This was the burial of a criminal, a rebel, a man who had broken the most sacred bonds of family and nation. This leads us to the final Alpha enrichment, the monument known as Yad Avshalom, or Absalom's Pillar. During his lifetime, the Bible tells us that Absalom had reared up a pillar for himself in the king's valley because he said, "I have no son to keep my name in remembrance." He was obsessed with his legacy. He wanted a monument of perfection to match his physical beauty. He built a structure that was meant to be admired for generations. But the real monument to Absalom wasn't the polished stone in the valley. It was the heap of rubble in the forest. For centuries after this event, it became a tradition in Jerusalem. When fathers would take their sons past the site associated with Absalom's memory, they would stop. They wouldn't admire the architecture. Instead, they would pick up a stone and throw it at the monument, spitting in its direction. It became a ritual of communal rejection. It was a teaching moment for every generation of Judeans. This is what happens to the man who prioritizes image over integrity. This is the end of the son who betrays his father. This is the weight of the man who measures himself by his own standard instead of God's. The man who obsessed over his weight, the weight of his hair, the weight of his influence, the weight of his royal claim, ended up as a literal mountain of stones. He wanted to be a monument of glory. He became a monument of futility. The Prince of Silence was finally silenced forever, not by a crown, but by a pile of rocks. The tragedy of Absalom is a warning that echoes through the corridors of power and the quiet halls of our own homes. It tells us that beauty without character is a trap. It tells us that justice sought through betrayal is just another form of crime. It tells us that the things we use to build our own perfection are often the very things that will eventually entangle us. David, hearing the news of his son's death, was broken. He didn't celebrate the victory. He didn't praise Joab for saving his throne. Instead, he went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. His cry has become one of the most famous laments in history. "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom! Would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son." In that moment, the Father of Peace finally understood the true weight of the kingdom. It wasn't in the gold or the chariots or the standardized measures. It was in the broken hearts of a family that had been torn apart by sin. David's grief was the final weight on the scales. He would have traded the crown, the kingdom, and the king's standard just to have his boy back, even the boy who had tried to kill him. But the forest had finished its devouring. The stones had been heaped. The Prince of Perfection was gone, leaving behind only a story of what happens when we try to measure our own worth against a standard we were never meant to carry. As we look at the empty monument in the King's Valley and the heap of stones in the forest, we are forced to ask, what are we building? Are we building a legacy of hair and chariots, things that look good at the gate but fail in the forest? Or are we building a life rooted in the wisdom that understands that the only weight that matters is the weight of a heart that is right with its creator. The rebellion of Absalom serves as a masterclass in how perfection can become a plague. It shows us that the most handsome man, with the most brilliant advisor and the most seductive message, can still lead a nation into a ditch if he is not led by the truth. The alpha information is clear. You can win the hearts of the people. You can win the battle of the gates. And you can even ride the royal mule. But you cannot escape the forest of devouring if your soul is tangled in the branches of your own pride. Jerusalem eventually returned to peace, but it was a scarred peace. The throne was restored, but the house of David was never the same. The king's weight remained the standard for the economy, but for the people, it would forever be a reminder of the prince who weighed his hair and lost his head. The story of Absalom is not just a history, it is a mirror. It asks us to look past our own unblemished surfaces and see the shadows we might be casting. It asks us to remember that the true king's standard is not measured in shekels or hair, but in the enduring stones of character, loyalty, and a peace that doesn't require a sword to maintain. In the end, Absalom got his wish. He is remembered. His name is known by billions. But he is remembered as the prince who had everything and threw it away for a crown he couldn't carry. He is the man of the eternal heap. And as the wind blows through the terebinth trees in the forest of Ephraim, if you listen closely, you might still hear the echo of the Prince of Silence, a warning to all who would stand at the gate and promise a justice they do not possess. The forest is still there, the stones are still there, and the king's weight is still being measured.